Now that we've found the end of the yarn, we're going to measure out 23 inches. You can do this using a measuring tape or a ruler, whatever you have on hand. When casting on using the Longtail method, you'll be casting on a right side row. So I'm going to use my needle that I've noted as my right side needle, which is my red needle. Position the yarn with the ball of yarn on your right side and the end of your yarn on your left side. At the point where you found your 23-inch mark, go ahead and fold that in half. So this is my 23-inch mark right there. I folded the yarn in half, and we're going to start by creating a slip knot. With your yarn bent in half like this, simply grab the top and twist it 1/2 turn. The yarn is still in a loop, but now the yarns are crossed. Pick up the loop again and put your fingers in from the back. Using this pinching motion, you'll then grab your yarn that is crossed underneath the loop and pull it through. This creates a slip knot. Once you have your slip knot ready to go, this is going to be our first stitch. So we're going to use our designated right side needle, and we're going to put the loop onto the needle. To secure this loop, we simply pull both ends gently until the loop is small enough to fit securely but not too tightly onto the needle like so. To cast on the additional 29 stitches, the process is a little different. Continue to hold the needle in your right hand. You'll then use your left hand to hold not only the end of the yarn here, but also the yarn that's attached to the ball of yarn. So using your thumb, you'll hook underneath the end of the yarn with no ball attached, and then using your index finger, you'll scoop underneath the strand that is attached to the ball of yarn. Then, using your remaining 3 fingers, simply bring them down into a fist so that you can hold both ends of yarn. Using the needle, scoop underneath your thumb and around your finger yarn, and then back through the hole. Then let go of the yarn in your 2 fingers and gently pull the 2 ends to secure the loop. You may find, especially at the beginning, that you'll have to reset your hands with each stitch that you cast on. I promise that as you continue knitting, this process gets a lot easier and faster. Again, to set up your fingers, you'll scoop the yarn that is attached to nothing under your thumb. Then you will scoop up the yarn that is attached to the ball of yarn in your index finger. Then you will secure both ends using the 3 fingers that are currently unoccupied, and then we're ready to cast on another stitch. Under your thumb into this loop, bring the needle around to scoop up this yarn in your finger, and then move back through the hole so that this stitch is now placed on the needle. We now have 3 stitches. Position the yarn under my thumb, under my finger, hold them with the other 3 fingers, scoop under the thumb, scoop over the yarn in my finger, and then back through the loop on my thumb, and that gives me that stitch. Drop the yarn, secure gently, not too tightly. Each one of these little loops is a stitch, so each time you did the scoop under your thumb and your finger to let go and secure, it added 1 stitch. So once you've reached 30, we can move on to the next step. So the style of knitting I'm going to teach you today is called English or throwing style, and that means we're going to be holding the working yarn in our right hand. we're going to grab the needle with all of the stitches and put that in our left hand, and then we're going to hold our blue needle or the empty needle and hold that in our right hand. Because the needle we're holding in our right hand is blue, we know we're about to knit a wrong side row. Following the pattern, we're going to knit every stitch for the next 4 rows. Here's how you do the knit stitch. Using your right hand needle, insert the right hand needle into the first stitch of your left hand needle from the bottom through the top. Then grasp your working yarn and bring it from the back to the front of the needle. Try to keep a hold of it a little bit while you grasp that right hand needle again, so that it adds a little bit of tension onto that stitch that you've just put between the needles. Now, take that needle out of the loop, and you can see our little stitch there. To finish the stitch, simply remove what's on your left hand needle off the edge. And that's your first stitch. Now that my first stitch is in place, I'm going to show you how I hold the yarn. So I hook the yarn under my thumb, and then I loop it around my middle finger. And that's how I hold the yarn to go into each stitch. So for this next stitch, I'm going to go up into the stitch. My working yarn is right at hand. I'm going to go from the back to the front in between the 2 needles. I'm going to secure the yarn so that it's easy to then have this right hand needle come underneath and out of that hole, so that we can remove this stitch because we're replacing it with the one on the right hand needle. Let's try it again. So step 1, we insert our right hand needle into the first stitch on the left hand needle. Then we're going to wrap the yarn from the back to the front around that right hand needle. We'll then hold on to both needles again so that we can move the right hand needle out of the loop we went into initially. And then we're going to remove the rest of that stitch off the left hand needle. So essentially we're just moving the stitches from the left hand needle to the right hand needle, and while doing so, we're adding an extra row every time. Continue knitting in this manner until you get to the end of the row. Here are some helpful tips to keep in mind while you're knitting. The closer you hold the needles together, the easier it'll be. So the needle goes into the stitch from underneath, wrap around the right hand needle from the back to the front, go back out of the stitch, and then finally bring the stitch off that left hand needle. In, around, down, off. So just remember, in, around, down, off. That's all it takes for the knit stitch. Once you get to the last few stitches, just take your time with them so that nothing accidentally gets dropped. When this happens, it means you've reached the end of your row. Congratulations! To start the next row, simply swap hands. And you're ready to go. Here's a pro tip. When you start the first stitch on a new row, it can be a little bit loose. So make sure that you pull your knitting down, because after this first row, you'll actually have a little progress to pull down. And make sure your working yarn is up front and not twisted around. It's just straight and not creating any additional loops. If you're in doubt that you've done it right, count your stitches and make sure you still have 30. That's going to be crucial through this whole project. When in doubt, count your stitches. We want to maintain those 30 stitches through the whole project. To begin the next row, we start just like we did in the previous row. We're going to go up into that first stitch. We're going to rehook our yarn around our fingers, and then we're going to wrap the yarn, come back out of the hole, and slip that first stitch off. Into the stitch, around the needle, out of the hole, off. Keep repeating this process until you've worked 3 additional rows. If it's helpful, try doing check marks or hash marks on your pattern so that you can keep track of exactly what row you're on. Congratulations, you've now completed the first 4 rows of your fingerless mitts. Take a look at your work because what you have right now is garter stitch fabric. If you're the type of person who likes to check off the progress as you've gone, feel free to do so by checking off rows 1 through 4 on your pattern. If we look at row 5, it indicates that this will be a wrong side row, and we are actually going to introduce a new stitch, the purl stitch. The purl stitch is the same 4 steps, just done in a backwards manner. So instead of going up and into the stitch, we're going to go down into the stitch. We're also going to ensure that the yarn attached to our ball is in the front with us and not towards the back. Then we're still going to wrap the yarn from the back to the front of the right hand needle. And then we're going to come and surface out of this stitch to pull it off. We're going to go again really slow. So we're going to go down into the stitch. We will still wrap it from the back to the front. Then we are going to come out of that stitch again and bring it entirely off the left hand needle. We now have 2 stitches. Repeat in this manner until you've reached the end of the row. Down into the stitch, around from the back, back out of the stitch, and remove the stitch from the needle. As you progress through your row, you may find it handy to scoot up the stitches that are on your left-hand needle and to scoot down the stitches that are on your right-hand needle. That will make the stitches on your left-hand needle easier to knit when they're ready, and then also keep the ones that are already knit on your right-hand needle out of the way. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. Repeat until you've reached the end of the row. Congratulations, you've completed your first purling row. Since, as indicated in our pattern and by how we've labeled our knitting needles, we've just completed a wrong side row. That means when you turn it over, you'll see a visual difference between the right side and the wrong side now. If we look back at our pattern, we've just finished row 5, and that was that wrong side row that we've just purled. Go ahead and check that off if you'd like. We're now going to move on to row 6, which is knit all stitches. So, with your working yarn towards the back, we're going to go into this first stitch. It's a knit stitch, so we go up from the bottom, we go around the right hand needle, we come out of that stitch, and then we remove it completely. In, around, down, out. Continue until the end of the row. That completes row 6, and as you can see, we now have 2 rows of stockinette stitch. So while all knitting has this very textural puffy stitch, doing a knit row plus a purl row has this very even flat side, which is very typical of knitting, and then the wrong side looks dramatically different and actually looks more like the garter stitch side. With row 6 done, I'm going to check it off. Once you've completed row 6, you'll see a little note reminding you about the right sides and wrong sides of the fabric. Then you'll see the next set of instructions which says, repeat rows 5 and 6 14 times more. That's right, you're going to continue purling 1 row and then knitting 1 row until you've done that 14 additional times. Now that I've finished my repeats, I'm going to go ahead and check that part off. There's not too much more to go here with our first mitt. All we're going to do now is repeat our garter stitch border before we bind off. Next, for rows 35 through 37, we're going to knit all stitches. You may notice that we have the blue needle in our right hand, which means that this is a wrong side row. And up until now, except for the beginning, we've done purl rows every wrong side row. However, since garter stitch is knitting on both sides of the fabric, we're going to knit this row instead of purl it. To do so, I'm going to ensure that the yarn is towards the back, and I'm going to go up and into that first stitch and knit it like normal. Into the stitch, around, down, and out. Continue this for the remainder of the row. Once you've finished that row, simply turn your work and knit the next row. The final row is another wrong side row, and we're going to knit all of those stitches as well. Completing this row wraps up row 37, meaning we've reached the end of our knitting. Typically, binding off is done on a right side row, and that's exactly the case here as well. Binding off will secure the stitches much like our cast on, except the other side. To bind off, knit the first 2 stitches. Once you have 2 stitches, simply leapfrog the first stitch that you knit over the second stitch you knit and off the needle. To continue on from here, simply knit 1 additional stitch so that you always have 2 stitches on your right hand needle, and then leapfrog off that first stitch over the one you've just most recently knit and off your needle entirely. Knit another stitch. We now have 2 stitches here. Leapfrog the first one, up and over the second one. Repeat this until you have 1 stitch left. Once you've reached your last stitch, go ahead and knit it. Just like before, you're going to leapfrog the first stitch over the second one, and now you're left with just 1 loop, and if you pull at it, you can make it quite large. Once you've reached this point, simply put your hand through the hole, grab your ball of yarn, and pull it through the loop. You can now tighten it to secure your knitting. At this point, you can cut your yarn from the ball. And that's it. That's all the knitting you'll do on this first mitt. At this point, you can either choose to cast on and create your second pair, or you can go ahead and do the finishing on your first mitt and then just go ahead and repeat the process after you've made your second one. Whatever you decide, I'll meet you right back here so that I can show you how to do the finishing work for your brand new mitts.